We have the good fortune of having some people here who will share with us some of their own reflections on what we just heard. Leah Simeon is a member of the Spokane Tribe of Indians. She attended Gonzaga University for both her bachelor's and master's degrees. She currently works as a secondary English teacher at the Muckleshoot Tribal School, which is in Western Washington. Jordan Thompson is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Jordan is currently an attorney for the tribes and serves as their state lobbyist during Montana's legislative session, which happens every other year for 4 months. He got his JD from the University of Arizona and his MBA in American Indian entrepreneurship from Gonzaga. So I just want people to pause for a minute and look at the Jesuit influence so far. Janine Hill Fletcher's, I think she was mentioned in somewhere else that she's got a Catholic education. Leah, undergrad, graduate degree. Jordan got a master's degree, and I work here. So anyway, Jordan, Dr. Hill Fletcher described the foundation upon which Indian law was built. What thoughts were going through your mind? And do you think that history, that foundation, has an impact on your present day life and work?
Chesquext, everyone. It's good to be here today. My name's Jordan Thompson, like my mom. I've got the good fortune of having my mom over at Gonzaga. Was saying I'm an attorney for the Salish and Kootenai tribes, and I'm a state lobbyist. And so right now we're at the tail end of our legislative session. So I'm very relieved that that's almost over with this session. So I really appreciated Dr. Hill Fletcher's discussion. I know part of the talk is looking at invisible structures. And so in dealing with law, a lot of times those are invisible to a lot of folks, but not to attorneys, of course. We have to be very familiar with these structures. And so what she talked about was one case in particular, Johnson v. McIntosh. And so that's Chief Justice John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the late 18 teens to the 1830 era. And so oftentimes we say it's the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy is the foundation of Indian law. And unlike a lot of other racist laws in the United States' history, like Jim Crow laws, like the Japanese internment laws, that law is still a good law. And so that's still the framework we work with today. Again, like she mentioned, I think Johnson v. McIntosh took place in 1823. And so in that case, it basically took all the land rights away from the tribes and said you have the right of occupancy, but not of ownership. And so those rights can be extinguished through purchase or conquest. Gave two ways that those rights can be extinguished. The Salish and Kootenai tribes, when I talk about the Salish Kootenai tribes, I might say CSKT because now we're the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I'm talking about 3 tribes. The Xanka band of Kootenays are up north, all the way up into Canada, and they come all the way down to the north end of Flathead Lake. The Pondereys or the Kalispes, that's the tribe that was right around Flathead Lake, down Flathead River. And we've got relatives all the way in Spokane, now known as the Kalispel tribe. And then the Bitterroot Salish or the Salish tribe were down in the Bitterroot Valley, south of Missoula, down the Clark Fork River drainage. And so the first time we ever saw white people was in 1805 when Lewis and Clark came through. And that was quite a surprise to us, as you can imagine. So this is just 15 years later when Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court are making these decisions up. And I say making them up because they're just pretty much pulling them from thin air. As I liked how Dr. Hill Fletcher described the European Christian heritage of these decisions. I guess one thing I'll mention right now is tribes have so many structures of our own. Like we talked a lot about white Christian structures. At the same time, tribes have incredibly complex structures where we're tied to the land, we're tied to relationships, we're tied to the cycles. And there was a slide that mentioned that. And so it's not like we were some primitive people. We've had a lot of knowledge and a lot of intimate familiarity with the land and how to live in alignment with the land for thousands of years. Our creation stories placed us here, and geologists who've looked at some of our creation stories and tied that to geological events of the past have said those line up pretty perfectly with events that have happened 12,000 years ago during the end of the last ice age, if not 40,000 years ago. So we've been here for a really long time, really done a nice job, I'd say, of maintaining our environment here. So going back to Johnson v. McIntosh in 1820, talking about how you can extinguish Indian title, 30 years later, you get settlers moving into the region and the United States trying to figure out what to do with the Indian problem, how to remove tribes from the area to make way for white settlement. And so we entered into the Hellgate Treaty. It's the Hellgate Treaty, 1855. All three tribes that I mentioned sat down with Governor Isaac Stevens. He was the governor of the Washington Territory, and we entered into treaty. The treaty lays out, we have two reservations, one for the Salish tribe down south, that was the Bitterroot Reservation, and the main reservation is what's known now as the Flat Reservation. It was very clear that the tribes wanted to live on two reservations. And so that's what they agreed to. We had off-reservation hunting rights, which became a big deal later on down the road. And in that agreement, we ceded over 20 million acres of our Aboriginal territory in Idaho, Wyoming, East Montana, for the exclusive use and benefit for 1.2 million acre reservation known as the Flathead Reservation, and again, the Bitterroot Reservation. Less than 40 years after that agreement was entered into, the Salish tribe was removed from the Bitterroot Reservation and placed onto the Flathead Reservation. It was done through forging of Chief Charlot's signature and presenting that to the Senate. And so the Bitterroot Salish never agreed to moving. They were forcibly moved in what's known as Montana's own Trail of Tears, and they were moved to the Flathead Reservation. During the 1890s, this is again less than 40 years after we entered into the treaty for our exclusive use and benefit of the reservation, there were all kinds of extreme sanctions placed on our religion, on our off-reservation hunting rights, on ceremonies. We were forced to go to boarding schools, and the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was really cracking down on everything that really kind of made us Indian. Dr. Hill Fletcher also talked about the allotment policy in the United States. And so in 1904, the Flat Allotment Act was passed, which was enacted in 1910. And so what that did was allotted each individual Indian either 80 or 160 acres of land and opened up all the excess lands for non-Indian settlement. So I'm just setting the stage because these are oftentimes structures that are invisible to a lot of people, but I'm intimately familiar with these things because I'm a tribal member and also an attorney for the tribes. And so in 1910, when the reservation was opened, almost immediately, you had non-Indians outnumbering Indians on our own reservation. You had a communal system all of a sudden being completely disrupted and a private property system introduced. You have a cash economy, and you have Indians now starving and having to give up their allotments for debts they have, either with irrigation fees or with debts at the mercantile store. So I just do that to kind of set the stage for 100 years. It's only 100 years ago, really, that happened. So 100 years ago, I'm coming out of law school, and now I'm an attorney for the tribes. And so the lay of the land on the Flathead Indian Reservation is we've got a population of about 30,000 people on the reservation. 25,000 of those people are non-Indians. And so we're completely outnumbered on our own reservation. We have three different types of property. We have tribal trust property. That's property the United States government holds in trust for the tribe. In 1934, the United States saw what a disaster the allotment policy was. And so it tried putting back the pieces through the Indian Reorganization Act, but it was only partially effective. So right now the tribes own, I'd say about 70% of the land here. Then you have individual tribal trust property. I'd say that's around 2% of the property where individual tribal members, either through allotment or purchase from another tribal member, were able to get individual tribal trust that's owned in trust by the United States government. And then you have fee land, and that's land that is for the most part under state control, state jurisdiction. Most non-Indians have fee land. A few tribal members like myself have fee land, and so I actually pay state taxes on the land I own. And then you have a lot of trauma, like a lot of that stuff I was talking about, like the boarding schools, the blowing up of the reservation, creating private property, capitalism, that led to a lot of trauma. And so at the end of the day, I guess the situation I'm in is you have non-Indians outnumbering Indians. You have a lot of non-Indian land on our own reservation, and you have a lot of trauma in Indian people. Going back just for a second to the structures I was discussing, like the indigenous structure and the non-indigenous structure, like the white Christian structure, oftentimes those butt up against one another. And that's my job. I try to present the indigenous perspective to the non-Indians in a way they can understand. And usually that's through the law, through economics, or through politics. And so that's my job. And I think I'll leave it at that for now, and we can get into more questions later. But I just wanted to really point out that those invisible structures are extremely visible here, and that's something I have to deal with every day, and oftentimes it's a huge challenge.
Thanks, Jordan. What about you, Leah? Dr. Hill Fletcher described an era of white nation building during the mid to late 1800s. She also noted that in 1881, the Spokane Indian Reservation was formally established by President Rutherford B. Hayes, and that Gonzaga College was founded in 1887. As a Spokane tribal member who attended Gonzaga University, what thoughts were going through your mind? And do you think that history had an impact on you as a Spokane tribal student at Gonzaga?
Hello, everybody. Let's see. So as we were listening to the lecture, I was kind of reminded of a funny story that happened as I was an undergrad at Gonzaga. I don't know, it might not really be that funny, but I just remember when we first, as undergrad students, wanted to decorate the space at Gonzaga. We called it the Indian House. That's where all the Native students hung out at Gonzaga. It's over actually behind Cataldo Hall, for those of you that are familiar with our campus. It was me and a very good friend of mine who decided to go to the Oregon Jesuit Archives, which at the time was in Foley. And so we were so excited. We were like, we're gonna find pictures that Gonzaga has, original pictures, and we're gonna put these beautiful pictures all over the walls of the Indian House that represent what that mission was at the time that we understood that Cataldo wanted to have a school for the Native children of the area. And so we were up there, and it was so cool. And we had to wear gloves, and we were touching all these original letters and pictures, and it was just awesome. And Wendy had found money to get really beautiful frames for all of it. So we spent a lot of time looking up there, and we're very happy and having a great time. And on the cart that was given to us of materials that might have been interesting was a letter from Cataldo. And it was a letter back to Rome in his handwriting in Italian. And the little translated note that was with the letter said that Cataldo wrote, "The school will always be for the Indian children." And we were like, yeah, this is the letter that shows that we are supposed to be on this campus, that it is good that we're on this campus. And so we decided, we were like, can we have this blown up? And we framed it, had it in the Indian House. Whenever people would come over to the house and we'd show them all of our pictures, we'd be like, can you see that? It says that it's the school is for the Indians. And so we were really, me and that other student, we were really proud of that letter. And I asked Wendy to go get a picture of it for me. So I don't know if it's going to show very good on my phone, but there it is. Oh, it's not going to work with the glare. It wasn't until a Canadian Jesuit was visiting us, and they said that the actual word that Cataldo used was savages to describe us. And so it was a little bit of a bummer, and we were like, oh man, this kind of sucks. So the actual translation is the school should always be for the savages. And that immediately just took the wind out of everything. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, is that Cataldo knew our languages, and he knew Coeur d'Alene and he knew Spokane. And to specifically use that language in his letter back to Rome is a bit problematic. And so it was a huge bummer afterwards. And we were like, oh man, like Cataldo, like what? I think that thinking back now, and the immediate like reaction to it was, oh, I don't even want to go into the Cataldo building, but that's where the Panda Express is, so I'll just keep going there anyways. But it really shifted in that time for me, that feeling of, do I really want to, and was I ever meant to be on this campus? And so I remember as an undergrad, I was pretty upset at Gonzaga a lot of the time. And now that I'm kind of reflecting on this story and thinking about it, I think a lot of that anger came from feeling alienated on campus. And this letter kind of, to me, is like the core of it. You know, feeling alienated in the way of just powerless. Like, what's the point of challenging these professors? I'm only one student. What's the point of putting myself at risk of trying to report them or pointing out what's the issues on campus, as well as feeling isolated and lonely. I think I've told a lot of people that my family from campus lives less than 5 minutes away, but I've never felt more lonely in my life than being an undergrad at Gonzaga. And then finally, like, everything just felt meaningless. You know, why am I doing this? All that kind of stuff. So really, it felt like every day my identity as a Native person was being challenged at Gonzaga. And as a young person, that was very hard to like work through. And especially of reading that letter and like, oh man, Cataldo thought we were savages. And then everything that we just heard about what is embedded in that word savage, like we're not even good enough to exist. Like, so all of that was kind of built into it. It's sometimes I look back on the letter and I laugh. Like, sometimes I feel like that's the best way to kind of try to reflect on it. Now that I've kind of thought of as a Spokane Treble member, knowing how important the diploma that I got from Gonzaga and all the things that I've learned, and being able to go to the Muckleshoot Indian tribe and work with their children, and the ability of me of having amazing like professors in the School of Ed. I don't know. So I guess it wasn't that funny of a story. I don't know. Sometimes it's funny to me, but anyways, I'll try to show the picture again, because one of the things that's really ironic is the word savage is literally in the middle of the letter, like savage, whatever the word is. Oh, it's not gonna focus. So this is in the house, I think, still, right, Wendy?
Yeah, it's still hanging in the house. So I think a lot of times Native people, I think we're known for our sense of humor, but I think it's a survival mechanism a lot of times. So thank you, Leah. So before we start our large group Q&A, I just wanted to ask both Jordan and Leah, if there's one takeaway you'd like people to have, one piece of information, one question, whatever, what might that be? Leah just got done talking. Do you have something to say, Jordan?
Yeah, it's tough breaking down 200 years worth of history in 10 minutes. So I feel like I skipped over a lot of parts, but hopefully you guys got the gist of what I was saying. It's like we entered into a treaty in 1855, and then it was violated once when they removed the Bitterroot Salish up, and then it was violated again in 1910 when they opened the whole reservation up. And now we're fighting every day for our rights on our reservation, which we reserve for our exclusive use and benefit in perpetuity, to be Indians forever. And I know that's how tribes are all over the country. And one thing that really sticks out to me when I try to talk to people about it is how they think that's an Indian issue. And what I always like to think about is it's a treaty issue, and we're all treaty people. And so the tribe sat down and sure signed that treaty, but so did the United States government on behalf of everybody in the country at that time and in the future. And so when you look at the state of Montana, there's a lot of non-Indians here. And the reason they're all able to be here is because we all signed those treaties. And so when I'm at the legislature or when I'm arguing a legal point, I really try to point people back to the treaties that we all signed and said, hey, we're all treaty people. And so I just invite people here to think about that, because I think a lot of time the default setting is like, oh, treaties are for Indians. And I'm saying, no, I think they're for everybody. And so a lot of times when you're looking at supporting different causes, or how do you do that, I think is just learning your own history, reading those treaties, or whatever, however the land you're on was acquired. I know in Spokane, they have executive orders, for instance. Like, how did that come to be? And how can you be an advocate on your own behalf? Hopefully in support of tribes, but I think it's stronger. Like, coming from a Native perspective, it's harder to argue a lot of times than coming from like the white dominant culture perspective. And so if we have white allies, that's really, really, really beneficial. So I'd just like to leave with people with the thought that we're all treaty people and in it together.
Thanks, Jordan. What about you, Leah? Words?
I think one of the best things that people can do at campuses for students is just, well, for one, Gonzaga, the Indian House, the space that Wendy created, was definitely one of the places that I felt that I could best be myself and grow as, a Spokane tribal member, and incorporate everything that I was learning about everything at GU as an undergrad into who I was as a person that could help me go back out and help my communities and work with my communities. So having that space was so powerful and important. So supporting that on campuses and supporting those areas, I think, is really important. And allowing students to be like their authentic selves in a space like that. As a high school teacher now, I know how important it is for our kids to be able to like just incorporate everything that they're learning into understanding how they exist in the world and their own communities, which takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of they have to be safe to be able to do that. And I also think that now, having my own classroom, being able to have honest conversations with my students of if I've done something that is upsetting or that is challenging, that it's okay that you can come and talk to me, but also recognizing that that takes a lot of risk on the part of the students. So having ways that my students feel safe to be able to talk to me about things is really important. Obviously, that takes a lot of trust, and you have to build it into your classroom every single day and at the beginning, and just reiterate that the students can trust you, I think, is really important. So I guess the two things that I would say is allow Native students to have spaces on campus to be themselves, because I remember Gonzaga always told us, we're teaching you these things so that you can go out and change the world, or better the world, that kind of stuff. Very Jesuit. I remember how to do the Jesuit exam and where you reflect on stuff, which is really good. But being able to do that with a bunch of other Native students in our space where we felt safe are the things that stuck with me. So I suppose those two things.
Thanks, Leah. So I'm going to thank Jordan, thank Leah, and they'll stick around with Janine Hill-Fletcher, and Becky will moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Jordan and Leah. Thank you so much for being here. Your stories bring to the heart of a lot of what we're trying to reconcile. And your voices are incredibly important. My family benefited from those treaties on Blackfoot and as a non-native. And Leah, somebody who went to Gonzaga as an undergrad and now as a doctorate, to hear that those things happen is just heart-wrenching. And so that's part of my reconciliation, is learning to love, but also recognize family and background. So, and where I benefited and how I can do better and be better. So I just appreciate you both so much. Thank you. Now we are opening it up to Janine, Leah, and Jordan to open. We're going to have a brief 15-minute open Q&A. If you want to type your question in the chat, I can read it. Or if you want to just say your name in the chat, and maybe I can call on you and you can unmute. And then that way we can get more questions in before we go into small group sessions. So I appreciate that. Any way that you wish to raise a question or a comment for Dr. Hill Fletcher, Leah, or Jordan. So you can either put your name in the chat and I'll call on you and you can unmic, or you can write your question in the chat and I'll read it. So any questions, comments? Would love to hear from anyone. Janine, Dr. Hill Fletcher.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank both Jordan and Leah. Your perspectives and your stories helps me to think about my own story in relationship to the Jesuit institutions. So I have a very specific question that maybe Jordan, this was obvious and I just don't know the history, but did the Jesuits and the foundation of Gonzaga, was that on the benefit of a broken treaty?
Oh man, well, the Jesuits have a long history with our tribe. So back, I'm not even sure, it must have been like the late 1700s. We had a tribal member who had visions of the black robes, and people didn't really know what that meant at the time. Until we had French fur trappers going through the area, and they were traveling with some Mohawk Indians, I believe. And so the Mohawks decided that they liked life better with the Salish, and so stayed there. And so when the Salish were telling about this prophecy, they're like, oh my God, those are the Jesuits. You have to go to St. Louis. And so to bring back the Jesuits. And so we sent 4 delegations. The first 3 kind of ended in tragedy, but we were a committed people. And so we sent 4. And on the 4th trip, we were finally able to bring back Jesuits with us. And so they set up a mission there. They were part of the treaty negotiations there. And I think from there, they continued west. So after they left our territory, I don't know much about what happened. I think they went on to the Coeur d'Alene area, the Spokane area. And as far as I know, there's no treaty that the Spokanes have. You talked briefly about that, but I'm not sure if Gonzaga was founded on a broken treaty or not. But they were certainly, I think, invited to the area by the Salish tribe and kind of went on from there. So that's as much as I know. Maybe somebody else can take it from there.
Thank you so much. Dr. Elaine Radmer asks, I'd like to hear more about the separation of church and state. When did it become such a big thing? Was it partially to cover the tracks of the tropes that you explained? Could you talk more a little bit about that separation?
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise. It just is a trope that I think people of my generation and all the way down through people of my students' generation come in and they say, because I'm teaching theology, I'm teaching about religions, and they say, oh, well, that's not right, because in the US we have a separation of church and state. And they seem to believe that means that no Christian logic and no Christian supremacy or Christian ideology was woven into the production of law or was woven into the systems of government. But but if we actually look at the debates in Congress, if we actually look at the legislation, Johnson versus McIntosh is rooted in, and you know, all the way through the various eras. All you have to do is open the congressional record, and you realize in every single, I mean, all the way up to today, people are reasoning with Christian logic all the time. And I think that this is, I think that Jordan underscored this in terms of thinking about law and invisible structures that prioritized white Christian ways of being and thinking, and prioritized white Christian citizens. So I don't know the history of it, but I do know that you know, when someone throws out, oh yeah, in the U.S. we have a separation of church and state, everybody nods their head, yes, of course we do. And the reality is we simply haven't in our history.
Good. Thank you. This question is from Peter Bisson. Dr. Hill Fletcher, what theological ideas do you find most helpful for decolonization?
It's a very good question. I think that, so part of my training has been in comparative theology, listening in and being in conversation with other worldviews. And so the little piece from George Tinker that I shared, I think we need to destabilize Christian theology as a worldview that is simply truth, or is simply the way that God best relates to humanity. But those are very foundational ideas within Christian theological tradition, right? So there's the whole work of destabilizing the very claims that we have as Christians. So central ideas like the reality that God is beyond our comprehension. If we really were governed by that, we would recognize the systems of white ways of being and Christian ways of being as one among many different ways of being, right? And so the theological idea that this reality that Christians have named God is something, is a reality that far exceeds what we could possibly contain, and that we might listen to and learn from other faith traditions. I think that's probably the foundational idea, and then to rethink, well, what do we do then with the claims about Christian supremacy that are written into Christian texts? Maybe that's another whole area of redeveloping Christian theological systems.
Great. This question is from Kevin Brown. I love the way Dr. Hill Fletcher uses theologics to describe the theological foundation of colonialism in US policy and historical practices of religious communities. As a Catholic theologian, what are some of the perhaps hidden, overlooked theologics that you would suggest Jesuit institutions should recover from the Christian tradition to decolonize our institutional self-understandings?
So in addition to God as mystery, I think we do need to reclaim notions of sin. I do think that not only theological ideas, but this white racial frame that presumes that that white Christian traditions are faithfully carried out. This is why I asked Jordan that question, right? That and why I, along with Leah, I have felt betrayed by my own Jesuit institution because I feel like I've been told, look, we're doing our very best to carry out, right, the theologic that we have inherited. That is, we're seeking to do justice. We're seeking the well-being of humanity. And so the theologics of doing justice, caring for the whole of God's creation, right? Those are some theologics that, yes, we need to embrace, and we need to use them to decolonize, but sometimes they also erase injustice, right? So Leah, you referenced Cataldo's letter and his use of language. Well, if we go back into these archives, we will see the ways in which those Jesuits that we hold up as the developers of our institutions that we buy into and that we believe in, right? They're using language of the Christian faith to erase the horrors of what they're doing. So there may be colleagues at Georgetown on the call, but when I read what they've digitized and placed in their slave archives, their archives of the Jesuits in the era of an economy of enslavement, I'm blanking for a minute. It's Jan Ruthen who writes a letter that allows for the Jesuits at Georgetown. So he's the superior general. He writes a letter for the Jesuits at Georgetown to sell enslaved human beings. And he names himself in the closing, your slave in Christ. It's like, well, it's the same sort of bait and switch that Leah is talking about, the way in which our theological traditions erase the very evil that is part of our history. Right. And so I know that we were looking for positive theologics, right? I think we have to really pay attention to the way in which our theologics elevate the work that we're doing, right, in a way that erases the very problematic practices. And I don't want to, one more thing. Our mission as Jesuit institutions, I have a very hard time wrestling for myself the fact that I completely buy into this mission, and yet the price tag on this mission excludes so many people from the very work that we're doing, right? So how do we do the work of justice? How do we do the work of mission in a way that doesn't just erase the sin in which we're situated? So I think that a deep engagement with Christian sinfulness would be a good place to start. I'm pretty sure that's not what Kevin was looking for. I think he might have wanted some more robust, which we do have to develop those as well.
He just responded, not necessarily looking for positive theologics per se. I'm all for recovering a robust notion of sin. So there we go with that. For Jordan, are there any law schools that teach Indigenous law?
Yeah. I went to University of Arizona. They have the IPLP, Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, and I loved it. So I'm a big Arizona fan. Arizona State has a good program. New Mexico has a good program. There's a lot of programs out there. I think University of Washington, they have a law clinic. Gonzaga has an Indian law clinic. I think they're going to do a federal Indian law class in the fall. We'll have to stay tuned to that. University of Montana has a clinic. And so there's programs out there. Yep. You just got to Google Indian law programs at law school. And I see in the messages, University of Victoria, Canadian law schools are really interesting to me because they're doing such decolonizing work up there. And so I'm really interested in what's going on in Canada, but I don't know much about the law schools up there. But University of Victoria looks like they have a good one.
Awesome. Any other questions for our panel, our morning panel? Yes, Elaine.
I haven't had time to type this, and hopefully that doesn't mean that it's not at all formed, but I've been struggling for a while with how young people or old people who are in educational systems believe that their central frame is respect. They believe that, but I'm trying to talk about these sorts of things that we're talking about today, and those things then seem to create a conflict that I can't actually communicate with the people that I'm trying to talk to. I don't know exactly, I guess I'm just curious if you think the idea of white belief in respect in education systems overlaps with the Christian theology or the law or your experiences, Leah. I guess basically, can you take this idea and go anywhere with it?
I'm wondering about the challenge with respect. If I'm hearing correctly, that means not drawing attention to the troubling histories out of respect for certain groups. Is that part of the, I mean, here's how I'm going to take it, and then you can reformulate and tell me. I'm really compelled by the work of educators, because I'm wondering, when do we start telling this story in a way that isn't just the march of progress, right? But that also isn't the march of dehumanization. That's not respectful, right? So how do we tell the reality of this history in a way that honors both the struggle of peoples who were resisting a white racial frame, but also name the systems of white oppression that have been invisible? Like, how do we do that, right? And I would love, I'm dying to put Leah on the spot, because it seems to me that your experience as a student at Gonzaga, you found ways of making that education work for you, but it sounds like you also ran up against places where it seemed to be structured in a particular way, that you had to, that maybe you had to work to make that your own. And I'm thinking about this with my students in my own classes, where even my best attempt, right, to narrate this history can sometimes still have a white racial perspective, right? And I experienced this with a student. I had asked him if I could share his words when I speak about this. We were talking about the history of the use of Christian scripture in the era of an economy of enslavement. And it was important to me that we wrestled with the fact that Christians used the scripture to enslave Africans and participate in the economy of enslavement. And we read also the work of African-American preachers, right, who used the gospel text in another way. And each student had to do a little 1 minute, response to the reading in a video format, and they were describing, oh, they did this, the white Christians narrated this way, and oh, they did that, and all of this sense of how terrible it was, of what was going on in the past. And this student simply said, I'm listening in on this era, and I realized that this was before we became free. And his all he had to do was shift the perspective to say, this isn't about someone else, right? This isn't about white preachers in the past or white people in the present. This is about me and my ancestors and my heritage. And all of this was taking place in the past, but it still is, right? And so the systems of white education and white professors within that and white teachers within that, respect, I think we have to rethink whatever respect is, and I'm not even sure I know what that looks like in a dynamic, multicultural, multi-religious, multiracial classroom that is authentically trying together to do something differently.
Would you like to add anything, anyone? We have about 1 minute. Go, Leah, it's you.
I think that when we're talking about respect in the classroom, I think it's important to acknowledge that respect is so culturally embedded. Like, if we're thinking about the culture iceberg, like at peers, like food, fun, and fashion, like respect is like all the way down at the very bottom. Like, how do you show respect and to other people, and like when is it appropriate, like all that kind of stuff. And so especially thinking about respect in the classroom and recognizing that respect is culture. So I think it goes back to, what culture are you asking your students to walk into when they come to your class? Like, how do you, how are you asking them to show that culture? And like, just a brief example from my time at Muckleshoot, we have a lot of non-native teachers. And at the beginning of the year, we had, and this was at the beginning of like COVID and like trying to figure out how to do online teaching. A colleague of mine was very frustrated because she felt like this student took a lot of time at the beginning of class by showing her teacher like her siblings, like introducing her siblings, and that the parent would get on and talk at the beginning of class and say like, oh, hey, like here's how we're doing. And she was really, really upset by it. And I kind of had to slow her down and say, well, do you realize how cool that is, that the mom is actually like talking to you, and this kid feels comfortable enough and respects you enough to like introduce her dogs and like her cat and like all this kind of stuff to her. And then also thinking about pre-COVID, a lot of my coworkers were very upset because they felt like, you know, not addressing them by certain titles, Miss, Mr., that kind of stuff, which is completely different, I feel like, in Muckleshoot culture, that she wasn't realizing I'm asking my students to walk in, to put on a different hat, to show respect that I built because this is my classroom. So I don't know, just culture is so, or respect is so culturally embedded in that we ask our students to walk into our culture when we ask them to come into our classrooms.